We have I don't say a long schedule, but we do have a little bit of a complex schedule. We have to property and casualty, personal lines insurance, and rate making trends. It's exciting. We have a briefing from MIA, and we have Kathleen Barand, who's the commissioner, Bill Fawcett, associate commissioner of property and casualty. Is that the only two witnesses you guys have? Okay. And after this, guys, we are going to have some hearings. So please don't sleep. And I think we can go ahead and get started now. Madam Commissioner.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you very much. Kathleen Brain, I serve as your insurance commissioner.
1 second, ma'am.
Is it okay? Okay. So, hi, I'm Kathleen, and this is Bill. And we're here today from the Insurance Administration to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in auto and homeowner insurance trends. And we felt like in order to make that conversation most meaningful, it would make sense for us to talk a little bit about the kind of the framework of how companies set rates and the statutory framework within which we review rates. So I will apologize in advance because Mr. Fawcett does have a meeting with a senator that was set up that he's going to need to exit by 3 o'clock for, which means that you will be stuck with me to the extent that you have questions that go over that time, and I will do my best to answer those questions for you. So let me just start, if we can get to the slide that says premium. Yes, one more. So what I wanted to start with was the idea of what does the policyholder care about? What do you care about? What does your constituent care about? At the end of the day, you care about the price. And premium is the price that a policyholder pays for the insurance that they are provided under that policy, right? And premium is a calculation. It's not one size fits all. It depends on what kind of coverage you got and how much coverage you got. And it depends on other factors that we're going to talk about in a minute. So premium is created, it's calculated based on rates and rating rules that the insurer files with the insurance administration. And one of the things that's unique about insurance, not just insurance, but is fairly unique with insurance, is that usually when you have a price, the price reflects known costs. So when an auto manufacturer manufactures an auto and puts a price on that auto, that the manufacturer is building in the costs that they already know exist. They know how much the parts cost. They know how much the labor costs. They know all of those things. Insurance is different. Insurance is a promise you make today to pay for something that may or may not happen in the future. So it is entirely predictive. All of the rates, all of the pricing that insurance companies do is future facing because it's that promise of if something happens. So I promise that if your house burns down, then I will cover that. I promise that if you cause an automobile accident, I will cover your liability. And so the effort that insurance companies make is to try to understand, based on prior historic experience and projections of what those trends are, how much do I have to collect today in order to pay what is likely to occur in the future? Not everybody is going to have a loss. Not everybody's going to have the same degree of loss. So how do we bring those large numbers together and begin to predict what those losses are going to look like so that I can back then into what I need to charge to cover those losses? So next slide, please. So if I'm an insurance company and I'm stepping back and I'm trying to understand what do I have to collect today to cover those losses, these are the elements of what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how much am I going to write in checks for claim payments, right? And then when I make those claims, how much am I going to pay adjusters or lawyers or other folks who are part of that claim operation? And then I need to understand what we call underwriting expenses, right? So all my general business expenses, my brick and mortar, my employees, producer commissions. So what I pay my agents and brokers, marketing, the Super Bowl commercial for State Farm, those are marketing costs, premium tax. And then the monies that they pay us, both for our premium tax and the fees for rate filings, et cetera. We're going to talk a little bit about this more in a minute, the cost of reinsurance, right? So insurance companies buy their own insurance so that if losses get too high, they can get reimbursed for that. So all of that plus what's called underwriting profit, a goal for underwriting profit. Now that's not absolute profit, because if you look at absolute profit, you're also going to look and talk about things like investment expense. But we want to make sure that the money in and the money out are such that you're never going to be underwater on the amount that's coming in. And having an underwriting profit is really assuring that what comes in is in excess of your operating expenses. It's not the final profit that an insurance company might make. So next slide, please. And those general considerations that insurance companies take when they make their rates are reflected in our statutory law. So if we look at the legislation that the General Assembly has passed and what it is that insurance companies should be considering when they're making their rates, this list aligns with what industry does and the costs I just talked about. Next slide, please. So when we talk about costs in that general sense, the overall goal is let's make sure that what I bring in is enough to cover what pays out. You have to think about that at two levels in the insurance world, right? First, we want to think about it in the aggregate, my whole book of business, my whole line of business. I need to look at it from that aggregate perspective, usually by coverage, right? So for all of the private passenger auto collision coverage, am I making sure that I'm charging enough to pay those collision related expenses, right? And we kind of call that a base rate. So what is the base rate for just that area of coverage? But you know what? Every risk is not the same, right? Because I can tell you I'm a bigger speed demon than Bill Fawcett. So I may be riskier than Mr. Fawcett where it comes to the likelihood of having an accident or an incident, right? So insurance companies also have to look at this at an individual level. And that's where this concept that you probably hear about called rating factors, that's where that comes in. Because what a rating factor is intended to do is identify what are the things about you or me that make us more or less likely to bring a claim. So just as an example, you have this base rate concept, and I just used an example here of a private passenger auto, and then you're going to have a coverage line, could be liability, could be comprehensive or collision or PIP or and then within that, you're going to have this unit of exposure. So like for every $1,000 worth of coverage, here's the rate. And then we're going to get individualized. We're going to look at those rating factors and think about what are the characteristics that are predictive of loss. And we need to identify them, and then we need to quantify them in order to assure to the best that you can that the amount of premium that a particular policyholder pays is reflective of the amount of risk that the insurer is assuming under that policy. So next, please. So again, the idea of trying to get to the place where premium reflects the degree of risk. And rating factors are what are used to differentiate among risks and are supposed to be the characteristics or predictive of risk. And I just provided some examples in private passenger auto. You can see these in combination. You can see lots more than these. Companies sometimes have a huge number, sometimes have a smaller number. And then within that, so things like, how much coverage, obviously, how many policies are involved, what kind of vehicle is it, what does it make and model? And then within those broad categories, like, for example, how much mileage per year, you're going to have subsets. So somebody who drives 10,000 miles or less a year will pay less than somebody who drives 50,000 miles or more a year. That's logical. The more you drive, the more likely you are to that. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry, I'm speeding through this, but I want to make sure we get through it. So that then this idea of selecting rating factors and assigning values to those rating factors, they fall within legal standards. So when insurance companies select those factors and they identify those factors and they quantify those factors, they file those with us. And the rule is that they have to meet certain standards. And those standards include things like they have to assure that when you differentiate among policyholders when calculating premium, that those areas of differentiation have to be actuarially determined. So an insurance company that chooses like if they were suddenly to say, okay, redheads have to pay twice as much, well, that would be absurd. And they wouldn't be able to show statistically that redheads cause more loss than non-redheads, right? So that would be a silly factor that they wouldn't be able to justify. But if you say the age of your vehicle is relevant to how much you should pay, that makes sense because the older the vehicle, the less likely, if it gets stolen, how much it's going to cost the insurance company to write that check. So ultimately, as the insurance company provides this information to us, it is fundamentally about assuring that when you make these distinctions among policyholders, that you are not engaged in what we in the insurance world call unfair discrimination. And that is a hard term for a lot of people to swallow because they're like, I'm sorry, what do you mean? Are you talking, can we have fair discrimination? In the insurance world, the answer is yes, because these are somewhat archaic terms. So I want you to think about discrimination when we talk about insurance regulation as discrimination with a little d, meaning literally distinguishing between me and you. So if you charge me something different than you charge him, you have to explain why. And those differences have to be fair and they have to be based on statistical evidence that they relate to the losses that we represent, the risk we represent. Discrimination with a big D is prohibited in insurance rate. So when we talk about protected classes and protected people and what you can or cannot rate on, those are just absolute prohibition. Next page, please. So this is a very simple example of what you may see as just using the kind of car that you have. So you will see that, and this is very typical for insurance companies, every car, the model year, the submodel, the body type, they have a symbol. And then that symbol also correlates to a factor, a rate for that factor. So you remember you've got a base rate, let's just call it $10. You've got that base rate, and that base rate is going to go up or it's going to go down as you apply each of these factors. So if you've got a 2000 Honda Civic and you've bought liability insurance, which you're required to buy in Maryland, and let's say it was $10 as the base rate for every $1,000 worth of insurance, right? Because you have a Honda Civic 2000 two-door, that BIPD liability, you're going to multiply that $10 by 0.92. So you're going to go down a little bit because you're less risky. If, however, you bought a 2001 Honda Civic two-door, your rate's going to go up a little bit. It's going to be multiplied by 1.01 because their loss history is telling you that the liability associated with that model and that model year and that type is riskier. So this is a made-up example just to give you an idea of how it toggles up and down based on very specific factors. Next page. Okay. So once the insurance company sets its rates and it files its rates with us with an effective date and the rates go live, it can't charge anything else until it files a new rating plan. And companies do that. Most companies do that on an annual basis. Not every company does, but they typically do it that way. And what happens is that they're going to now adjust their rates as they go forward to address changes in the loss experience or cost, and because of their own business needs and desires. So you may have a company that says, you know, I want to maybe back away from motorcycle coverage for one reason or another. So they may choose to up those rates within what's actuarially justified because they want to shift the mix of their business. But essentially what companies are doing on an annual basis is reevaluating the loss information and seeing what changes do we have to make sure that what we're bringing in is going to be equal to what we're paying out. Those rates are set by insurance companies using their actuaries who are professionals who take 10 extremely difficult mathematically driven exams to be able to understand the relationship in all of the data and information that helps them to make the projections by factor. Those are then sent to us, and then our actuaries review them. We'll talk about those standards in a second. And I think what's important also to remember is that there is no single correct rate. Actuarially justified rates fall within a range, and companies choose where they want to land within that range to meet their business needs and their business mix desires. So next slide, please. And here's again, just a very simple example, because our rate filings are far more complex than this these days and are very complex predictive models. But just as a simple example, you would look at for any particular variable on these particular lines of coverage for bodily injury, you would say, okay, currently we're at 0.9. And again, that's at $10 multiplied by 0.9 for this variable. We can go down. You know, our losses are less than we thought. So our indicated is 0.7, and we're going to take 0.8. So we're going to come down from 0.9 towards our indicated rate. So this is the kind of thing that gets filed with the Maryland Insurance Administration. Now, if we turn to our next area, we're going to talk just a little bit about, well, what happens when we get that information? So for property and casualty, private line, personal lines, when you've got home, and we're talking specifically about homeowners and private passenger auto here, when we review these rate filings, we do it on what's called a competitive rating and a file and use basis. What that means is that under Title 11, Subtitle 3 of the insurance article, our authority is to receive the rates. Companies do not have to file them and have prior approval. They can file them and use them immediately. We have good relationships with most of our licensees, and so most of the time when an insurance company is going to do something very different, they will give us heads up and they will give us runway so we have more time to evaluate before it just goes into effect. But they don't have to, but typically they do. When we receive it, we review it to make sure that the numbers make sense, that the numbers are actuarially justified. When it comes to, however, deciding whether we don't set the rates and we don't agree or disagree with the rates, right? We determine whether they fall within an acceptable range. And the area that probably we get the most questions about is, well, their rates seem very high. So while insurance rates can't be excessive under a competitive rating model, which is what we have in Maryland, the Insurance Administration can't determine or can't declare or decide that a rate is excessive and say you can't use it until we've also had a hearing to decide that there is insufficient competition. Because the idea is that we have enough companies that they're able to compete with each other, and that's going to keep the rates from being excessive because the market considerations will prevent them from being excessive. So unless we find that the market conditions are such that there isn't adequate competition, we do not determine and we do not find that a rate is excessive. So that is Mr. Toad's wild ride version of a little bit about kind of rulemaking, rate making 101. And hopefully that'll help you a little bit, because then what I think we'll get to is looking at what we see happening in Maryland right now. And Mr. Fawcett is going to take over for that.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm Bill Fawcett. I'm the Associate Commissioner for Property and Casualty Insurance. And thank you for having us here today to talk about an important issue for Maryland consumers. You could, pardon? So on the first slide that you're looking at, what we've done is we've presented the top 10 insurance companies in Maryland by their market share and what their indicated rate change, that's the amount that Kathleen was describing that the actuaries will determine is necessary for them, followed by the average percent of rate impact. So that's what they actually take and what hits us when we receive our insurance bills. What you can see on the first page is an average for the last 3 years from 2020 to 2023. And what you can see here is both the indicated change and the impact on consumers. And then what we'll see in the following pages is a look at each one of those years, year by year, to show what's happening. So if we could advance to 2020. What you're seeing in 2020, this is when COVID happens, you see that rates are going down a little bit. That's because of a number of factors. And then when you go to the following year in 2021, you'll see that the rates are somewhat stabilized. Most of the impacts are down. You've got some zeros in there. There's a blank space. That means that company number 7 didn't file rates that year. And so there was no change. And so now you've got something a little bit stable. And that's exactly because of COVID. When you go to the following year in 2021, again, you'll see that the rates are stable. Sorry, 2022. You'll see that the rates are starting to jump back up, and they're coming back up to the rates where they were in 2020 for the COVID. And then it's also starting to reflect that history of losses that Kathleen was speaking about filtering into their numbers. For 2023, now you can see that there's a lot of rate being taken. This is what I think your constituents are calling you about. But there's also range. You'll notice that in the top 10 companies, the range is between 1.7 and an 11.7 impact. That is reflection of a competitive market because these 10 companies are all competing for market share. And it also tells you that consumers have a choice and they will shop around for other options. But as you'll also notice from the preceding slides is that the rates are generally up and they've been generally, up or stable for the last 3 years. So that begs the question, well, what's causing these rates to go up? And Kathleen addressed some of it when she talked about, well, what are the considerations that the actuaries have when they're predicting what the premium should be? The big driver right now is the frequency and the severity of losses that they're seeing. In an auto policy, you're going to have 2 components. There's a liability component and a property component. On the property side, what you're seeing is the cost of everything that has to be done to fix your car going up. So you see the general inflationary pressures that are coming to repair your car, both in the labor and the materials. You're also seeing that car parts are more expensive and sophisticated now. We like to say that, the windshield's no longer a piece of glass or the bumper a piece of metal or plastic. Now they'll have integrated cameras or sensors in them. And so those prices are now creeping into the loss experience and history of these insurance companies, and they're adjusting their rates to cover that. You're also seeing that the rate of vehicles that are declared total losses has been going up. That's partially because of the airbag deployments and the cost to do that. So when the costs exceed the value of the car, then there becomes a point where it's uneconomical to fix it and they declare a total loss. And aside from that, you're seeing the lingering problems that we all have in terms of the supply chain, labor challenges, and then you're also, when cars aren't returned to their owners, then you get the ancillary costs like the rental that goes along with it while your car is being repaired. Those times are increasing too. On the injury side, so once you injure someone and you have to pay for their injuries, carriers are reporting that there's been an increase in the severity of these claims and increased litigation. And then when you put that on top of increased medical costs, which we're seeing because of inflation, now you have a better picture of what the insurers are confronting every time they have a claim. And then finally, the other big driver right now is the reinsurance costs, which Kathleen mentioned. And this is when insurance people like us get kind of geeky and excited. But this is how we hedge our bets or spread our risk out to other markets. So if I'm an insurance company, we will cede some of our risk off to reinsurers, and we have to pay for that, and they will cover part of it. And what's happened over the last few years is that the rates for reinsurance have gone up, which means the cost of the insurance company has gone up. And the other thing that's happening is many of these reinsurance companies are restricting the capacity which they're willing to provide. So for example, in the private passenger automobile field, they know that losses are going up, that the loss ratios are bad, and they're not as willing to deploy capital or their reinsurance capacity to insurance companies for that. What I can tell you is that Maryland is not unique in the rate increases that we're seeing. And when you compare us against the others, we're slightly above the midpoint. we're certainly not as high as the big states. So Minnesota, New York, Louisiana, Nevada, they're the ones that are getting the highest increases. But the overall national average right now is 19%. And S&P has also taken a look at the last 3 years. The weighted average is 17.6% increase across the industry. What I think. So now maybe we can turn to the homeowners rates and trends that we're seeing in Maryland. The story is not much different for homeowners insurers than for automobile insurers, for the reasons that Kathleen was explaining about how they calculate rates. So once again, we've got that we begin with the chart that shows the 20 to 23 average rate changes and impacts on consumers. You'll see that the rates have been fairly stable for 20. Pardon? Sorry.
It's taping us for posterity.
Yeah, my mom is very excited, so thanks. So what you see on the next 3 pages, as we did with the auto insurance, you'll see that the rates for 2020, 21, and 22 are fairly stable. And then when you get to 2023, you see quite a significant rise in both the indicated rate that the companies need, but most importantly, the amount of that indicated rate they're taking has now gone up significantly in comparison to the preceding 3 years. And so what's driving these increases? Well, much the same as for auto. You have the general economic conditions, inflationary pressures on labor and materials, the lingering supply chain and labor cost issues. Also, once again, you have the increased frequency and severity of claims. We should note that, while we're not California and we're not Florida, we are seeing an increase in the number of severe convective storms in Maryland. We've heard that from producers, from our insurers, and that is driving some of the costs in Maryland for homeowners insurance. There's secondary perils, which are not the primary, but there may be another cause of loss to your home in addition to the primary one, like the fire or the wind. There's also been a rise in what people are asking for in their demands and their settlements and the judgments. This is sometimes referred to as social inflation. So that the cost of settling these claims has gone up. And then the other one that it may not be intuitive at first, but the number of solicited claims or fraudulent claims that we're seeing or that the insurance industry is reporting to us has gone up significantly. So if somebody comes through your neighborhood and they're going to get you a free roof and all your neighbors a free roof, that has an impact because it changes what the actuaries were predicting the losses might be. Again, the increase in frequency and severity of litigated claims is also a driver here, and the hard market conditions, the deteriorating performance of the insurance carriers as a whole, and the increased reinsurance costs. So again, these are the same general factors. Maryland, again, is not unique. We're in the average. We're in the midpoint. And maybe if I may talk about what are we doing about this, or I know we're short on time.
I think absolutely. The only additional thing I would say is that with homeowners, maybe a little bit different than private passenger auto, is that this is also where we're seeing climate change touch Maryland, because that global capacity is having a local impact in terms of what the reinsurance markets, the capital markets are willing to put out there. And that capacity is narrowing. What that means is that an insurance company might add a surcharge to a certain type of risk because they can't reinsure it. So they know they're going to have to take all of it, and that's going to cause a change in their rate. So the way the things that are happening globally we're beginning to see a distinction in the Maryland market, particularly with regard to reinsurance costs. We have met, Bill's going to talk about this next. We've met with a lot of carriers to talk about what they're experiencing with Lloyd's and with other reinsurers, and the 50 and 75%, rate increases on lines of business, and then that flows into what their rates are. So.
Yeah. So thank you. Good introduction. I appreciate that. So one of the things when Kathleen asked me to come over to the MIA was to bring maybe a different skill set or a different viewpoint than they've had in the past. So I've run insurance and reinsurance companies. And so and the reinsurance companies in particular gives that wider, more global view than perhaps some insurance companies have. And so we've tried to do that. So part of my remit as the new associate commissioner is that we've embarked on a proactive process to understand what these rate changes are, why they're happening, rather than the reactive things that we're getting now where we see it through complaints or filing. So we're being very purposeful in the way that we are trying to analyze the market, and we're looking forward. So not just the things that are happening currently or this year, but what are the trends that are developing that we're seeing out on the horizon so we can anticipate them. The good news is that we have colleagues in other states that we collaborate with very well. We collaborate well with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and they're helping us understand what they've seen and their experience so that we can apply it here and be ahead of the curve. Kathleen said we're also meeting with insurers and producers to understand their view and what they're seeing. And then as we're talking to them and understanding the dynamics of the market, we're also looking specifically at both the affordability, but the availability of insurance, because we're also, anecdotally seeing some contraction of underwriting guidelines. And we need to understand that and how it's happening. But I have to say, we're early on in this process. We're just beginning it, but we're thinking about how are we going to address the issues that your constituents are facing, and whether there's sufficient competition in the market and what the factors are that are driving this change. We're also using new tools and analytic techniques to look at underwriting guidelines. We're expanding our staff. So we've just been fortunate to get a new actuarial pin. And that's
we want to make sure that you have time
to
to ask questions as well. And don't get us wrong. I mean, we have a great staff at the MIA that's stable and does a great job in all the things that they do. But we do know that as Maryland becomes vulnerable, that other states have to some of the impacts of the global markets, we need to do more to get further out ahead of what's happening. And that's part of the reason that bill is focused on that particular area, because if we need solutions, legislative solutions, we need to be able to know what's going on so we can bring them to you. So we're happy to answer your question.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't know if I have a few questions. Obviously, this was for the good of the group. Want to make sure everybody understood, because we do get some insurance questions in here. I didn't want to ask you about the rate review system that you currently have. It's not one, basically, other states have it different. They do it differently, correct? The rate review standards, or because they file their rate increases and you just review them.
They vary from state to state. So the methods are prior approval, which some states have, file and use, which some states have, like Maryland. And then on top of that, competitive rating, which limits what you can disapprove based on. And some states have that. So there's a combination of them throughout the US.
And do you feel that our current system is sufficient for what you're trying to do in the state?
I think that what we have seen traditionally is that we have a very competitive market, and you can see even in years where there's a lot of rate being taken, there's a lot of variety among what companies are taking. And so I think that it has worked for Maryland, and it's worked for Maryland well. And part of what we need to do is the work we're doing to make sure it continues to work for Maryland.
Thank you. Also, we get bills here time and time again for more transparency in the rate making schemes. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Could you briefly explain to my committee why that's an issue, as far as when they said transparency, what exactly are they talking about?
So Most states protect the proprietary nature of a company's rating plan. So what they think about is their secret sauce of how they adjust this variable versus that variable, or change and combine this thing versus that thing, because they think they've built a better mousetrap of how to segment that risk and get that pricing just right, because they want to get business and they want to get good business. So as they're figuring out, how do I rate you? How do I decide? There are elements of that that are, they find highly proprietary, they're trade secrets. And there's a different philosophy among the states about how much of that ought to be a trade secret. Maryland is kind of balanced in that there are elements that are, at the end of the day, public, and then there are elements that are retained. There's confidentiality that's retained. And as we go through the review process, things are pretty much confidential until the review process is changed. So Maryland is pretty in the middle in terms of wanting to make sure that there's public information available, while also allowing competition to thrive, because people can preserve their kind of their own secret sauce.
Sure. Okay, and lastly, we really didn't discuss this, and there's several issues. So in your discussions, especially with the increase in insurance rates, auto insurance specifically, how does that impact MAIF? Because you aren't you also over MAIF?
Yeah, so the MAIF is subject to the competitive rating laws that are under that same subtitle 3 of Title 11. And we've not had a circumstance where anyone would suggest that MAIF's rates are excessive. The issue that's come up with MAIF, and I'm happy to review with your committee at any time our report and their response, but the issue with MAIF has been whether or not their rates are adequate and whether they take rates that are adequate. So if I want to get super legal technical about it, if you look at 11306, what it will tell you is that the Insurance Administration cannot conclude that a rate is inadequate unless it determines that the inadequacy is going to result in insolvency. So in a hyper technical way, MAIF can never be insolvent because MAIF has this assessment mechanism. I kind of have a slightly different view of how we ought to apply that. And so then I think that it is possible for the Insurance Administration to dig down deep into their rates and to actually find their rates to be inadequate. And that's an approach that the MIA has not traditionally taken. The approach traditionally has been to look at sort of, are there indicated rates, what they filed, do they make sense? And not really go back and say, well, wait a minute, your indicated rate was 26, you took 5. Like, that's not acceptable. You're not going to make enough money. You will have no underwriting profit. And that's why you keep losing money.
And therein lies my question, because number one, so is it safe to assume that it may be cheaper for me to go through MAIF to get my insurance?
It depends. So there are people that go to MAIF because for them, the rates may very well be lower. There could be a lot of reasons for that. There may be people that are in MAIF that over time, because they've become better drivers, their rates for MAIF are more competitive. And if they move to a private carrier, it's going to go up because of credit scoring.
Correct.
Because MAIF doesn't credit score. So there's a balance in terms of, MAIF is about 1% of the market. And from our analysis, we believe that there are people that are in MAIF that would be able to be insured elsewhere. I think that one of the things that we noted in our report for the General Assembly to consider is, how do you really want to, who should be entitled to come to MAIF? So what should the eligibility of MAIF be? Should it really be only people that can't get insurance anywhere else? And if there is an affordability factor, how do you bake that in? So you look at 17 states, including Connecticut, are states that say you can come to the residual market, which is what MAIF is, if you haven't been able to get insurance, or if you haven't been able to get insurance for a lower rate. And those are kind of policy decisions around, how do we think about this residual market mechanism, which is supposed to be there to ensure people that are bad drivers and can't get insurance anywhere else. How do you, if you want to bring in affordability, how do you do that in a way that's really fair to everybody? Well,
and I guess for our consumption, because we know that we inject millions of dollars every year into MAIF, including this year. And it's of great concern to me that we keep scaling this up. Like it's a discussion I guess you and I have to have offline about their rates, because not only are they not self-sustaining, they're very costly. And they're costing, you know, and when times their budgets are tight, like ours is, you know, $10 million means a lot. So I would definitely like to, you know, talk to you about that further. Again, I don't see any questions. I know it's kind of dry sometimes. It's rough. I appreciate you guys for
Okay.
sticking there. Jeff, you did great. You seemed super nervous. You turned real bright red, but that's kind of cool. But you did a good job. But I'm sorry, Lily has a question, but I just want to say you guys, I did a great job. Delegate Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner Brain, it's always great to see you.
Thank you.
I love the way you explain complex subjects and dry subjects like insurance in a very commonsensical way. And I always appreciate your guidance in my legislative work. So this is a very simple question. I recently heard a lot of chatter and complaints about car insurance rates going up, and it seemed like a pretty obvious jump for almost all of the ratepayers. So I'm wondering if there's simple explanation we can share with people to explain, is that a global supply chain, the car is getting more expensive, or what is it?
So it's all of those things. It really is the idea that on a year-over-year basis, the amount that insurance companies are paying out in losses is going up. And what they have to pay to get reinsured is in some cases becoming cost prohibitive. And that's what is reflected in the rates. It's hard sometimes because when you're talking about a rating plan, you're talking about 100,000 little factors, right? And so once they make those adjustments and they look at where those costs are going up, you can have, I could be with the same insurance company and I could see my rate stay actually the same or only go up a little bit, and his double. So what is it about that? Because they're constantly refining where those losses are coming in. One of the things we are trying to do, we wanted to make sure that we had this presentation first. We've been collecting information, and please remember, we're here for your constituents. Come and talk to us, send them to us. But we've been working on, we have a version of it on our website right now, where we're working on sort of that, that guide to the consumer about what's happening with your rates and why is this happening, and the kinds of things that you may be able to do about it. So Joy Hatchett, who is our Associate Commissioner for Consumer Education and Advocacy, is working on that with Bill Fawcett. As soon as we get that finished, we would be happy to send it to you so that you can see it as well. You can offer to your constituents and then you can send them to us. But it really is the fact that, you know, that bumper that used to cost, you know, $100 for somebody to bang it out now costs $5,000.
Again, thank you for presentation, Bill. I know you have to leave. I'm not sure if you guys are participating in these hearings, but we do thank you. And again, I would like to get back online with that the MAFE conversation after looking at our budgetary issues. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. And we do have a document for you that will, which we didn't present here, which will kind of make comparison of where everything else is happening in the industry and then where MAFE lands in all of those same years.
Well, I hope it's as exciting as your presentation was. I'm just playing. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm like a sleeping pill. I know.
Yeah. All right, colleagues, we're immediately going to jump into our bill hearings for today. I'm going to start with House Bill 36. Oh, no problem. We're not immediately going to. We're at some point in time going to.